Mr. Rich Howell, who lives in Western Massachusetts, just got some news from the State House in Pennsylvania. So he's going to share that with you. Mr. Howell, let's give him a nice warm hand.
Thank you. For those who did not hear me a couple of years ago when I was last here, what we're going to discuss today is the Declaration of Independence. Today is Independence Day, and you may think to yourselves, okay, what's he going to say? What's he going to talk about? And I think it's going to be important to you because you're going to hear the Declaration as it was meant to be read. What it meant, why it was written the way it was, and what the significance was before it had been written, during the time it was written, and after it was written. On July 4th, 1776, Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. 2 days previously, they had voted on a resolution, which we'll talk about a little bit later, that they ought to be free and independent states. July 4th is the date we celebrate because that's the day that was officially adopted and signed by the President of Continental Congress and a few of the other delegates, for that matter. Everybody's heard about it. We've all talked about it. But nobody's really examined it for a very long time. So what I'm going to do is give you a brief history as to what had happened and what brought us to that point. Actually, can you people hear me this way?
Yeah.
You know what? I'm going to dispense with this. Maybe it'd be a little easier for us to... We can applaud. No mic. It's a little more authentic this way, too. The American Revolution happened for a reason. It did not happen in a vacuum. It wasn't something somebody dreamed up in a matter of a few days. In today's world, and the reason the Camp Constitution exists, is to bring us back to our roots, to bring you back to your roots. Things are done a lot differently today than they were then. And not everything has been for the better. When you look at the American Revolution, you look at it in a certain context. In order to understand American history, you have to understand English history. I won't use the term British because the British usage was relatively new at the time and not used by a lot of people. It referred to the British Parliament, the British Army, the British Navy. It really did not, in most cases, refer to the people as a whole at that time. Later on it does. Understand the history of England, many of which played out here in the colonies after being settled in the early 1600s. The fight for liberty, the fight for our God-given rights, and understand God was a very important part of that. Part of the reason we lose it today because it's been taken out. Going back to the English Civil War, which was a war between king and parliament, which we'll explain a little bit later on what happens with us, to what they call the Glorious Revolution. Another fight between king and parliament. Parliament wins both of those. And the American colonists are involved in both. It was about arbitrary rule, which was very foreign to the English nation. It wasn't anything we were used to. We weren't doing anything differently. So, what led to it? We know that 1760, after the 7 Years' War was coming to an end, it would go on for another 3 years, King George II died. What is significant about that? He was part of a dynastical family that had been brought into Britain after the death of Queen Anne, the last Stuart monarch, who would govern much differently than her fathers and her grandfathers had. At that point, the Hanoverians let Parliament rule England. George III becomes King of England in 1760. Ironically, who is one of the guests there is a rich merchant from Boston and his nephew. And that nephew happens to spend a lot of time with George, just the two of them. That man's name was John Hancock. Very ironic considering what happened later on. So, what does George III do? Well, there was a group in England known at the time as Tories. These believed in the divine right of kings, arbitrary rule, believed in almost a feudalistic type of society. Many attributes of that were manorialism, indentured servitude, slavery, top-down arbitrary rule by the few. What does he do? Well, he's surrounded by these people. He has a very great dislike for his grandfather, and his grandfather disliked him, so he pretty much tries to undo everything his grandfather did. He wants to start in England, but he doesn't dare do it because he's committing what have been known as capital crimes. Our patriot forefathers are accused of doing that in this time frame. That was not the case. But he had to start in the part of the empire that was the most powerful and the fastest growing. That happened to be here in the American colonies. And what I mean by most powerful doesn't mean we had the largest populations. We didn't. Philadelphia was the fourth largest city in the British Empire, though, at that point. And we use British in reference to the whole of the empire. So what ended up happening was the greatest repository of the old Whiggish philosophy. The Whigs were the party of parliament, the party of individuals, the party. Many of us ascribe to these values today. They were the opposite numbers of the Tories and vice versa. They had controlled Parliament in the early 1760s. What does George III do? Well, as king, he can create nobles. He can create lifetime peers, which means people who distinguished themselves in the military in those days, or in the arts or sciences, or in politics, go into the House of Lords, which is the upper chamber. You're in there for life. Or hereditary peers, which is a little tougher to create, but a few were created, where your family inherits the title after you die, so long as you have issue, male issue normally. So it was easy to get control of the Lords. It was a friendlier body. House of Commons. He takes his public treasury, or his royal treasury, and he ends up buying offices. In England, to this day, if you were watching television, or if you saw the Brexit debates, or if you saw the parliamentary elections, people stand next to each other when they're running for office, standing for Parliament. George III, unbeknownst to the Whigs who got caught unaware, would buy these men, and he would outspend the opposition in ways they'd never seen before. And then he had a majority in Parliament. What's so important about that? He tries very early on not to rule by decree, because that will get him into trouble. He's in England. He's not in France. He's not in Spain. He's not in Austria. He's not in Russia or Prussia or in the Eastern countries. He gets into serious trouble if he tries that. So what does he do? He pretends to work through Parliament. And of course, he has a lot of willing accomplices. So that's what led to the events bringing up the American Revolution. And the Declaration of Independence spells this out perfectly. We all are aware of the events of April 19th, when there was an order to disarm the colonists, particularly in Massachusetts. We were aware of the Battle of Bunker Hill. At that point, the early Patriot Founding Fathers were not looking to set up an independent country. They wanted to be fighting for their rights as Englishmen. They wanted part of this Commonwealth they and their fathers have fought so hard for over there and over here. What happened to make that final break? Well, that's what we are going to talk about here. July 5th, 1775, ironically, Continental Congress issues what is known as the Olive Branch Petition. They are trying to reach out to the king and the parliament, controlled by the Tories, asking for reconciliation. Asking to say, look, let's work this out. We're not here to divide the empire, but you seem to be. Let's see what we can do to work this out. Well, King George III wants no part of that because his plans will not work if he does this. What does he do instead? He issues a proclamation for suppressing rebellion and sedition. He declares the colonies out of his protection, meaning that that's his way of saying, I can come and get you. He gets it through Parliament. At the end of the year, Parliament puts in something called the Declared All-American Acts. Basically, the declared colonies out of his protection, declared American Acts. All American cargo and vessels are forfeited to the crown. meaning that the commerce now belongs to King George III and his ministers. You hear this term ministers. These were his leaders of the Tories in Parliament. And as time goes on, he comes from out of the shadows and he becomes more omnipresent in these openings. Quite often the patriots will refer to the ministerial army, the ministers. They won't talk about the king because the king is an office holder, technically. And so they are technically loyal to the crown, but not him specifically now, and we will see what happens. I want to give you a quote. And the quote reads as follows. Believe me, dear sir, there is not in the British Empire a man who more cordially loves a union with Great Britain than I do. But by the God that made me, I will cease to exist before I yield to as the British Parliament propose. And in this, I think I speak the sentiments of America. Thomas Jefferson, November 29th, 1775. That is, in a nutshell, from the author of the Declaration of Independence himself, what our people were thinking at that point in time, particularly through the leadership. April 12th, 1776, Halifax resolves. This came out of North Carolina. Many people in North Carolina celebrate this as the independence. This is not what this was. Trust me, I've done the readings, I've gone through the parchments. It was not a Declaration of Independence. What they were saying is they were instructing their delegates to Continental Congress to vote for separation from Great Britain. Because now there was talk of it. By 1776, after all these acts come through, we discover that there's no redress left in any government institution left in Britain. Now we have to live the dream of the old English forebears that we had admired, John Hampden, Algernon Sidney, many of whom envisioned an English republic. They had one briefly, but they lose it. We discovered that maybe we need to go in that direction. On April 23rd, Chief Justice William Drayton of South Carolina declares the king has no authority over the province of South Carolina any further. May 4th, 1776, Rhode Island, also celebrated as an independence move, but it wasn't. But it's big. They absolved all allegiance to the king. What does this mean? The king is now being called out publicly for the first time in a large way. You don't have the right to do what you're doing. You're breaking English law. Everybody's heard of Magna Carta. You may not know what it was, but it set out early the terms for the king and the subjects and what becomes Parliament. He violates them. He violates the Declaration of Rights from 1688. The other statutes of laws that were passed from the English Civil War, which were still on the books, still are today, and binding. He violates those as well. What are they saying? We're having a problem with the way this king is violating the covenant and the laws. And make no mistake, do the readings, you will see that's what had happened. Richard Henry Lee in Virginia brings a resolution to Continental Congress meeting in Philadelphia, June 7th, which read basically as follows, that these colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. Now you have a series of colonies that are now saying, provinces, this is our only recourse. Between 1775, we want to fight as Englishmen. Now we find that we have to fight independently. And that's what brings us to where we are now. What I am going to do is I'm going to read clause by clause the Declaration of Independence and explain what each one means. In Congress, July 4th, 1776, the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to separation. Since biblical times, men were chosen how to be governed. Go back to the book of Samuel, for those of us that are well read in our scriptures. King wasn't a forever divine office. It was something that was chosen by the people when they chose to do it. And God had told the people in Israel, you don't want a king. I'm your king, so to speak. Greater than that. But they didn't listen, gave him a king, and he told them all the things a king would do. The philosophers who influenced him, I talked about a few of them. If you read John Locke, who was very influential here, Algernon Sidney, John Hampden, who loses his life in the English Civil War, the way Joseph Warren does later on in our Revolution. or vice versa. They read like Bible studies. They're scriptural references. When I read John Locke for the first time, it was astonishing. I wasn't surprised, but I did not realize the breadth and the depth that they relied on those scriptures and when they did what they did. And it was the same thing with all the English patriots down through the ages. So, what they are saying to people is, we're not a bunch of ragtag rebels. We have a legal precedent for what we are doing in our own Constitution, in the English law, and now this is what it's come to, and this is why. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That when any form of government becomes destructive of these needs, it is the right of the people to alter and to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as shall them to seem most likely for the safety of inhabitants. Prudence will dictate the governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly experience hath shown that mankind are disposed to suffer while evil is insufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, and this is a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to overthrow such government, and to provide new guards for their future security. Such to them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having a direct object for an establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. They are saying that this particular monarch is acting like a tyrant. This is how he's doing it. We aren't just doing this lightly. This is very difficult for us to do, but it is of absolute necessity. Not only is our Commonwealth built on it, but the entire Commonwealth of England and the British states were also built on this as well. We had God-given rights, timeless, self-evident truths. That's how these societies reform. Over time, a lot of these societies degenerated into tyranny. We talk about France. France did not start out as an absolute tyranny. Neither did Spain. They degenerated into that over a long period of time, hundreds and hundreds of years, going through the histories of those countries. The ancient world. We all know about the Roman Republic turning into the Roman Empire and how it changed the face of Rome and the world forever. The Greek city-states. The great orator Demosthenes warning against King Philip of Macedon, whose son was Alexander the Great. They didn't listen to him, and the Greeks lost their freedom. So, the history of the present king was mentioned because of the Hanover dynasty that I told you about. They had fought 2 rebellions against people who wanted to bring the divine right of kings back. We've all heard of the Jacobite rebellions, or some of us have heard about them, the Highlanders, right, that revolted. These were not Scottish wars of independence. Englishmen fought on those sides too. These are people who believed in arbitrary government. They believed in the divine right of kings. And George I and George II in 1715 and 1745 fought against those and beat them, obviously with the people in the Parliament. Now George III is using some of their enemies from his grandfather and even his great-grandfather, those who were still alive, to try to bring something back. This was astonishing and frightening. And it started in England before it started here, and they were the ones spreading the word here. Look out, they're coming after you. And again, this is to show that they're not just declaring independence. Hey, we feel like it, we need to be free, we need to be our country. Yeah, it's just we're separate, we know there's an ocean between us. No, that is not the reason. Not the full reason at all. And sufferable, as long as they could go through it. What were some of the things that happened? Well, we hear these stories about men like John Hancock. They're supposedly smugglers, right? Well, John Hancock was not doing anything any differently than any other English merchant was doing. The problem was, Parliament started passing acts in the 1760s, stating that if you had an American ship, you had to sell your goods to England or an English colony. Even some of the English colonies you weren't allowed to go to. In India, they were not allowed to go to. It was controlled. Who were favored? Not the English, but the English merchants that supported the government were favored. That's where the East India Company comes from. They had been established before that. That's where the tea troubles come from. So now all of a sudden, what they were doing legally for years has now been declared illegal, but they have no say in the matter. That's one train of abuse. It got to the point when Hancock's ship, the Liberty, was seized, and then later pressed into the Royal Navy, that he sprung into action, and he did very greatly. He has refused his assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. All laws passed in the colonial legislatures were sent to Britain for approval. It was traditional. There wasn't anything wrong with it. There wasn't anything that oppressed us about it. It was part of the way we worked with each other. Any laws passed by them did need the king's signature. And it was supposed to be a formality. George III decided, I'm not going to do this anymore. Now, why on earth would he do something like that? Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, I imagine many of you have heard of it, written around the time this happens. Adam Smith astonishingly writes, maybe not so astonishingly, in 1776, early 1770s really, that the fastest growing part of the world were the North American English colonies. Not up in Canada, not down in what is now Florida, but the 13 colonies that were the mainstay. He also envisioned that one day the capital of the British Empire would no longer be in London. It may end up being in Philadelphia. Something that's not talked about a lot. If you are an English Tory or a British Tory, how do you feel about that? So there's another reason to come after here too. Remember what the actual object in mind is. It's total control. Now, he has forbidden governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance unless suspended in their operation until his assent shall be obtained. And when so suspended, he is utterly neglected to attend to them. Obviously, some of the troubles that we had, and this wasn't universally the case, because the Indian tribes, the native tribes that were here, were all different types. The ones who lived within the colonial settlements tended to work a lot with the colonial people here, actually fought alongside us in the Revolutionary War, or we fought alongside each other. They were part of this. The hostile tribes, again, had friendly special arrangements with the government in London, different. They would attack the countryside. Other things, protection. The French and the Spanish were still out there looking for revenge. They didn't care anything about it. The Americans never did, even when they were our allies. That's another story. He refused to pass laws for that. Immigration. They wanted that, and it wasn't just immigration from other parts of the world, largely from Britain. He put an end to that. He did not want to have other Englishmen coming over here. Other laws to pass so the colonies could govern themselves, he'd stopped, and he stopped it deliberately so he could, modern parliaments, gum up the works. And that's what created a mess here, creating anarchy, really. Royal governors would not draw updated lines for legislative districts, so they would not have proportional representation. Now, most of the governors here ended up becoming royal governors, meaning the king would actually appoint them. And with a king such as this, it was becoming a big problem because they were doing in their colonies what he was doing in London. He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of the public records for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. Again, trade being the largest part of what was happening here in the colonies at that point. The Admiralty courts were moved to Halifax, Nova Scotia, out of Boston, New York, Charleston, Baltimore, big ports here at the time. There the crown officials had more influence. Now, a lot of settlers in Nova Scotia that supported the American Revolution. That's a whole other story for a whole other time. But in Halifax, being a newer colony, former French territory, the crown officials had more sway. They were brought there so they can control what the verdicts were. Treason cases were going to be tried in Britain. They weren't going to be tried here in the colonies any longer. He has dissolved representative houses reportedly or repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. How many people come from states that have state legislatures? That should be everybody. Right? The first one he dissolved was in Massachusetts. How did he do it? He ordered his royal governor, who was actually the commander-in-chief of the military forces in America at that point, William Gage, another conflict of interest, and opposing the British Constitution. It's unwritten, but it opposed it. He just said it's over. Okay, I want you to dissolve the body. They dissolved the body. Now, did the body dissolve? No. The body reformed elsewhere outside the confines of the king's troops, and they continued to function. They would function in Concord, which is part of the reason it was fighting it there that day. And it happened in different places as well. So, he has dissolved elected provincial assemblies basically at their will, and he had no power. There was no power for him to do this, no reason for him to do this. Nobody was rebelling at this. They were opposing, again, using the court systems that they had here in the colonies, which is another matter, but they were under the ways that had been imposed for years. He has refused for a long time after such dissolutions to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative powers incapable of annihilation have returned to the people at large for their exercise, the state remaining in the meantime exposed to all dangers of invasion from without and convulsions within. This is a tie-in to the clause, I read 2 clauses ago. By refusing to allow the new assemblies to be elected, the authority for these assemblies now returned to the people. Obviously, we have that tradition, that law, that God-given right to govern ourselves. Again, within the British Constitution itself. As with the absence of legal authority, it created great anarchy again, and that's what was meant to happen. Reading at the time frame, we lose a lot of this now, we're getting it back. What was happening there was very, very frightening. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose obstructing the laws for their nationalization of foreigners and refusing to pass others to encourage their migration hither and raising the conditions for the new appropriations of land. One of the big mainstays and the reasons from the beginning that people immigrated here from England, even other parts of the world, was because of the land. They could obtain land very inexpensively, very freely, and they became landholders. In England, it was becoming harder with large landholders over there, and the fact that it was a much smaller country. Here, they could have all sorts of land. In fact, many of the defections from the British forces was due to that. They were promised land. The other thing he did, in order to stifle the growth of the colonies, he cut off new settlement and meant to grow and to weaken the growing power of the colonies here. He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. When it came time to replace their courts, he would withhold his assent, so we had huge amounts of judges who were not being appointed. However, he would appoint them, which led to the shutting down of the courts in Worcester, not too far from here. He attempted to gain power over them by using the laws needed to maintain them. One of the biggest examples is in North Carolina, due to a clause which the legislature refused to surrender over the immigration and the courts. So he hoped to control the judiciary here in order to enforce his edicts. Where have we seen that before? Anything foreign to us today? No. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and the payments of their salaries. Now, what he does is these judges used to be paid by the colonial legislatures themselves and the taxes raised locally. Not any longer. Now they're paid by the crown directly through his crown officials and his royal governors. What do you suppose happens there? What happens to the writs of assistance protecting the rights? What happens to people trying to redress grievances? Now he's out to control the judiciaries in each one of these colonies. Very unprecedented here. The last time something close to that was tried was in the 1680s with King James II, and there was a revolt here as much as there was in England. That was the Glorious Revolution. Now, he has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people in need out of their substance. We heard about the customs officers, right? We've had them here. What was unusual and peculiar about the customs officers now? Like the judges, they were paid for by him and that group of ministers and those Tories. They went to harass the people, collecting the taxes, seizing the cargo, making them buy goods they shouldn't buy, they didn't want to buy. That's where the tea comes in again. And it was creating a huge problem all over the continental seaboard, from Massachusetts, which included Maine at that time, all the way down to Georgia. So he set these things up arbitrarily. That's why our forebears are very angry, to say the least. He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. There was no war going on. But after the 7 Years' War and the Indian Pontiac uprising in the Northwest, they had some troops. They kept them here during the 1760s. And when these intolerable acts and all these other acts were passed that were violating our rights, and Bostonians and Massachusettsans in particular decided to object, well, they started occupying the city of Boston. You saw what happened from there. That was from 1768, folks. That was 7 years before Lexington and Concord. And these people were quartered. Royal Army, Royal Navy. So you, sir, you have a house and you have a barn. British officer walks in and said, sir, well, we're going to use 3 of your rooms and we're going to use our barn. And by the way, I have 6 men in my detachment, and you have to provide for all of them. You provide for the food, you provide for their needs, you actually pay for everything that these men have except for their uniforms. And who knows, even that. And they have the choice of the rooms. It's not like, well, you know, they'll take the master bedroom. They'll use your barn. If you need to do something for your animals, too bad, they get precedence. And by the way, hay's expensive today. Imagine what it was like back then when it was more in use. That was your quartering act. That wasn't even done in England. But they started to do it here. Now, they would have eventually, but they don't get around to doing that. He has affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. I mentioned General Gage. Admiral Graves is his naval counterpart here. Although he doesn't have an official position, he has a very unofficial position where he can pretty much go up and down the coast, particularly in Massachusetts, and pretty much determine what vessels go where. He meets with about successes, Gage does, but it is a very serious problem. So now you have the British Commander-in-Chief, who's the Royal Governor. In South Carolina, you have a former Royal Naval officer who is the governor. In New York, you have a Major General who is the governor. And it happens up and down the continental seacoast. He has combined with others to subject to for jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation. One of the biggest complaints for the anti-independence, anti-founding fathers argument was, well, you had to pay for the 7 Years' War. That's false. Our men, our blood, our treasure helped win that war. They paid. In the case of Pennsylvania, they did do something unfortunate in the war, but they heaved to and they ended up paying what they needed to pay. That wasn't the problem. After the 7 Years' War, our charters went from sea to sea. That's how the English charters went. And all those lands were expected to be settled by our people. That was the promise. Well, George III abrogates that promise. One of the provinces that's basically the biggest province we conquer, which is essentially what we know as Canada at that time, is Quebec. Who ruled in Quebec?
French.
Well, the French did. And after the war, there was going to be an English civil government there, which there was. He reinstitutes the French civil government, and he has the bishops out of Quebec City run things. They even excommunicate priests that don't like what they're doing, and many of them serve as Continental chaplains out of French Canada, by the way. And now all of a sudden Quebec goes back down to the Ohio River, so we're stuck on the eastern seaboard again, in that part of the country. And who knows what's going to happen in the rest of it, because our people are not allowed to go by the proclamation line of 1763, which is essentially where we were before the colonial wars ended with France. So, that does not do very well, and they're saying, if he's going to do that with a feudal type of government, what does he have in store for us here? And they can see it very clearly. So, he has combined, now the Declaratory Act declared that King and Parliament have full authority to govern over the colonies. So anything from the provincial legislatures were null and void. For protecting them by mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on these inhabitants of these states. After the Boston Massacre, those soldiers were tried here in Boston, and all but 2 of them were absolved, and they were branded by the hand. What the court said was, if this ever happens again, any type there's going to be this kind of trouble, they're not going to be tried here. We can't trust you to try them here. It's going to be tried in Britain, ostensibly under courts favorable to the government. So the one address that they proved themselves in was being taken away from them. For cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, I talked about the act seizing the cargo on the ships. The restraining acts outlawed any colonial trade with foreign nations. Imposing taxes on us without consent. Sugar Act, Stamp Act, Tea Act. Depriving us in many cases of the benefits from trial of jury. The use of admiralty courts, which had no jury jurisdiction, with smuggling accusations, most of which were manufactured. That's how Hancock's ship was seized. He wasn't tried in a civil court, tried in admiralty court, controlled by the government. For transporting us beyond the seas to be tried for pretended offenses. Here he was invoking the Treason Act of 1543. That was during the days of King Henry VIII, folks, by declaring the Americans could be tried in Britain for any such treason. And that was before there was any colonial settlement of Englishmen anyway. So they would lose the right to jury trial by their peers. For abolishing the free systems of English laws in a neighboring province. We had talked about the Quebec Act. That was scary. Because if he's going to do it there, as I mentioned before, what is going to happen here next? Taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our government. He unilaterally, through his parliament, but unilaterally essentially, took away the charters for all the colonies, meaning that they were just kind of there to exist at the pleasure of the Tories. The Intolerable Acts, which outlawed Massachusetts town meetings. I don't know how many people come from Massachusetts. We still have town meetings. I believe New Hampshire still has town meetings. We all jealously guard our rights at town meeting. Well, he declared those illegal for suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with the power to legislate in all cases whatsoever. The New York Assembly was suspended for failing to completely implement the Quartering Act. That means they implemented some of it and they still got suspended. Why they did some of it, I don't know, but they had. He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. That was his quaint way of saying, I'm coming to get you. After force was authorized in 1775, the king declared his intention of conquering the colonies as if a hostile power. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coast, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. The British seized several provincial vessels and bombarded several towns, most notably Norfolk, Virginia. If he was going to bomb down Norfolk, Virginia, who was going to be next? Baltimore, Charleston? At the time, maybe not Boston because the British troops were there, but they would try it later. This forced us to form an army and a navy. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous of ages and totally unworthy of a civilized nation. He has constrained our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against the country and become executioners of their friends and brethren and to fall themselves by their hands. The first part of that clause, there's two parts. The first part of that clause is dealing with the Hessians. We've all heard about the Hessians. Mercenaries. Technically, they weren't really mercenaries. George III, being a Hanoverian, I mean that he was an elector of Hanover. He was part of what was called the Holy Roman Empire, which was the sort of a forerunner to the Austrian Empire later on when they had to retreat. He had the right as a prince to contract with the other princes. This was an alliance with the other states, mostly what they call the Hessian states. They had Hesse in the name in those areas, but not all of them were in those states. 30,000 of these men came over. Why did they come over? Because they could not recruit enough men in Great Britain, particularly in England, the most populous part of Great Britain, obviously, to do the job. Americans were being impressed on these ships, and they were being forced to serve on these ships. Most of them attempted to say, look, I'm not going to serve against my fellow Americans, you have me, I'm a prisoner. In many cases that was honored, other cases it wasn't, which led to executions and mutinies where sometimes they were able to take over the ships with the help of other English sailors. So that takes us more than halfway through. He has excited domestic insurrections among us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. I had talked about the tribes here in America before. Actually, we have 4 more clauses to go. Some of the tribes, the Wampanoag tribe in Plymouth, Massachusetts, and the Powhatan tribe in Williamsburg, Virginia, Jamestown, friendly. Tribes on the western borders were basically enforcing the edicts of George III. These were the tribes who were attacking the settlements, and it was being encouraged. However, the first Indians used in the American Revolution were at Bunker Hill, and they were the Stockbridge Indians that came out of Stockbridge, Massachusetts, ironically. And the Crown went ballistic. British officers went ballistic. Whenever an Indian or a black soldier was captured, they were probably killed on the spot by the English or sold into slavery. So, this domestic insurrection were among the slaveholders that were patriots, the ones who were Tories. No. And for the few blacks that did join, many of them were resold into slavery from supporters of King George III. Not all of them were, particularly at the end of the war, but more blacks served in the ranks of the Continental Army than served in the British Army, and the Navy as well. At every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress, and the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character, thus marked by every act made to find a tyrant, is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. The Olivet position, scarcely a year before, was issued to the king. He came out with his edicts basically saying, I'm not talking to you, I'm going to get you for resisting me. Now we have been wanting an attention with our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of the attempts of the legislature, the parliament, to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our immigration and settlement here. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity, and we have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to avow these usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They too have been deaf to the voice of injustice and consanguinity. We must hold, therefore, acquiesce in the necessity which announces our separation and hold them as we hold the rest of mankind. Enemies in war, peace, friends. This was the most painful part of the Declaration of Independence. I gave you the quote of Jefferson in the very beginning. These people did feel a great kinship with one another. The problem was, things over in the mother country got very apathetic. Things were happening over there, and they resisted at first, but then after a while it became apathetic. Ironically, probably more support in the home colonies, in the home islands for what the founding fathers and the colonists were doing here than there was from the government. The problem was they weren't doing much of anything at that point. But because we had to declare our independence, now we were going to be officially at war with the mother country, and that's what they were telling them in writing. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. And that as a free and independent states, they have the power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all other acts and things which independent states may have right to. For the support of this declaration with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. God was a very powerful force for the founders, as I mentioned before. Appealing to heaven and trusting in divine providence was the foundation for the cause and their cause. Now the document reaches the heart of the matter. They declare, now that they have done this, they can act as a free nation throughout the entire world. Signed on behalf of the Congress, John Hancock, President, attest Charles Thomas, Secretary, Philadelphia, printed by John Dunlop. So folks, that is our Declaration of Independence explained within the past few minutes. Yes, I do have time for some questions. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I've been wondering. I heard that gauntlet that you're wearing is supposed to block a sword punch to the throat. How is it supposed to work?
Oh yeah, my accoutrements. This is a gorget. Now the gorget was worn by officers of the time, the 18th century, early 19th century. It was a holdover from the armor of the Knights of the Armor. Actually in the 1600s, during the days of the English Civil War even, half armor was still being used and the neck brace was the last part being used. And then what they did was they made it smaller and then it became a symbol. It's actually a pretty effective tool to deflect bullet maybe, or a blade thrust or a blow. But that's what this is.
Thank you.
In fact, for those who are interested, I did bring this along with me. I did not wear it here for the circumstances, but this is a sword, British officer's sword. It would have been carried by a lot of the American officers who were veterans, either in provincial or British units from the colonial wars. A lot of swords that were made after independence here in America would have been patterned on that. Yes, sir.
Can you look into the blade of the sword?
I'm sorry?
Stand up when you have a question, Lisa.
Can you look into the blade of the sword?
Sure. If you guys want, I'll be here for as long as you want. If you want to see any of the accoutrements, I'll be more than happy to show them to you. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Why are you wearing a scarf around you?
Oh, this is a sash. This is the mark of an officer, a general officer normally. So one of the things going back again to the 15 and 1600s, they would wear sashes to determine who was leading the men. And of course, on the battlefield, you could see this. Of course, by this point in time, there were other things to distinguish an officer. Between this, and then the epaulette and the ranks, you could tell where the commands were coming from. Yes, ma'am.
Who are you supposed to be dressed up as?
I am dressed up as a Continental Major General. You could fill in the blank. I don't have a specific character I'm portraying. I do that for a lot of reasons, because when I speak to you, I really, to do justice to that character, would have to portray him as he was, and my efforts go elsewhere. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
What's the necklace? The gold
This one? Oh, that was the gorget the other gentleman was asking about. That's what officers would wear. Yes, sir.
What is that stick used?
The thing I kept doing this with? That's a walking stick. It's very functional. Obviously, it was a measure of status, too. It could be used as a weapon. In fact, there were a couple of instances where this happened. Also, too, if you're in public assembly, to get attention or to applaud or to show your appreciation or disapproval of things. Yes, sir.
You can also use the walking stick as a fence post if you have to.
Oh, yes, you can. Yeah, I mean, you could use it all sorts of ways.
Fence post.
Oh, you mean a fence post? Ah, that would be a misuse of such a fine stick, sir. Yes, ma'am. Yes. If you were, this is interesting, by the way, because I can get into the other part of it real quick. The only people that carried swords were officers, maybe NCOs, sergeants, except in two branches of the military. One were the horsemen, the dragoons, and the other were the Marines. And the reason being, horsemen on horse and Marines on ship had to have other means of defense for them. A man in the ranks or the artillery could have a ready supply of ammunition. Sailor, a Marine, or a horseman would not. So they were the only enlisted to carry sidearms like that. Well, I'll be here for a while, folks. And by the way, for those who are interested, within a half hour, I am going to do a regular reading of the Declaration of Independence. I do it every 4th of July, so I'll be out there talking to the birds or for anybody who wants to join me. Thank you very much.